Good morning, or afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are at. This is Asar M. Hotep with the Madu-Ndela Institute for the Advancement of Science and Culture. I just wanted to greet everyone and introduce you to our new course for Madu-Ndela, and that is the Research Methods in Africology, which is the African centered study of African people or Africana-studies. And so this is week one, the introductory week for this class. And what we have now is an old slide in which I have created that is applicable for this introductory course. So there will be a separate video on how to do the inner workings behind the scenes of your class that you have registered for. So, but for now, this is just a straight uh, presentation, PowerPoint presentation. And so the earlier, before this class was formulated, this was titled Afrocentric Methodology and Proper Research Design. This is an original slideshow that I put together for the Honor Raw Squad radio show on Blog Talk Radio. And so, when we say Afrocentric methodology and proper research design, in essence, we're talking about Africology. So, again, Africology is the African-centered African-centered study of African phenomena. And so I'm going to introduce you to just some research concepts that will be important all throughout this course and throughout your studies as an autodidact, and getting into what Afrocentricity is and how to articulate and understand what Afrocentricity is and how this framework is the one best suited to examine and analyze African phenomena, including diaspora studies, literature review, things of that nature. And so we're just going to get into it. Our objectives are listed here below, so I'll just read. One of the purposes of a course in research is to help you learn how to think critically about things people tell you. Is their research sound? Is the conclusion they draw the best one? Do they have something to gain from getting certain results? This process of critical thinking is a hallmark of science, but it is also a useful tool in everyday life. Our primary considerations: the selection of a research design. There are three types of designs in research. And so there's qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods design, which is a combination of numbers 1 and 2. And so we're going to get into the details of what that is. There in your files for the classroom will be a document, I think it's called Cresswell 2007. It's a Research Designs and Methods edition 3. And so a few of these notes is going to come directly from that document. And so you have access to that. It should come with your course, so you'll be able to download that. So with a quantitative approach to research is what we call a post-positive worldview. It's experimental strategy of inquiry and pre and post-test measures of attitudes. So a lot of what we consider the hard sciences like physics and statistics and mathematics, well, not mathematics, because you can't experiment in math per se, um, but astrophysics and things of that nature. Anything where there's you have to count something. You transfer data into numbers and do calculations. That's a quantitative approach, which they call a post-positivist worldview. In this scenario, the researcher tests a theory by specifying narrow hypotheses and the collection of data to support or refute the hypotheses. An experimental design is used in which attitudes are assessed both before and after an experimental treatment. The data are collected on an instrument that measures attitudes, and the information is analyzed using statistical procedures and hypothesis testing. So we test hypotheses in a quantitative approach. This is again most geared towards your hard so-called hard sciences like physics and chemistry and things of that nature. A qualitative approach, which is a constructive worldview, is ethnographic in nature and observation of behavior. So this is more geared towards the study of human beings, or even to an extent, biology when you're studying animal behavior per se. But primarily, this is for ethnographic work, study of human beings and how individuals and groups behave. In this situation, the researcher seeks to establish the meaning of a phenomenon from the views of participants. So listen to how that plays out, because this is going to be critical in understanding why Afrocentricity is a valid framework to do research when studying African people. And so with a qualitative approach, again, in this situation, the researcher seeks to establish the meaning of a phenomena from the views of participants. So if you're studying African people, you want to get the views of a particular phenomenon from their center, from their worldview, them being agents of their own reality. So this means identifying a culture sharing group and studying how it develops shared patterns of behavior over time, therefore ethnography. One of the key elements of collecting data in this way is to observe participants' behaviors by engaging in their activities. So some of your studies will be ethnographic in the sense that you can actually observe them live. But in a historical analysis, that may not always be the case, because a population may no longer exist as an identifying group. Or, you may just be doing a synchronic study of the past. And so, you may have to analyze either text or sound recorded material from the people of that era, a case in point like ancient Egypt, but you won't have live access to them, so that you'll still be studying a people, but you'll have to use other means to ascertain how they would probably most likely view a particular phenomenon, from their perspective, if for example, they have writing in that community. Continuing, a qualitative approach is also participatory worldview, narratives, design, and open-ended. And so, for this study, the inquirer seeks to examine an issue related to oppression of individuals. To study this, stories are collected of individual oppression using a narrative approach. Individuals are interviewed at some length to determine how they have personally experienced oppression. Mixed methods approach, what we call a pragmatic worldview, which is a collection of both quantitative and qualitative data sequentially. The researcher bases the inquiry on the assumption that collecting diverse types of data best provides an understanding of a research problem. The study begins with a broad survey in order to generalize results to a population, and then, in a second phase, focuses on qualitative open-ended interviews to collect detailed views from participants. Again, or I should note that a few of these texts is primarily concerned with the study of human groups. So, they'll lean a lot towards a qualitative research. So that'll be kind of the language that you hear, here. And so there's a lot of more present contemporary research design or research approaches to the study of human beings in their setting. So just keep that in mind when you're reading this. So now, again, we're talking about Africology and research design within Africology. So important within any academic field of study, and you must remember that Afrocentricity in large part is an academic framework and academic research studies model. But it also, because of our unique circumstances, it is a worldview in a sense for a people, a population, in order to utilize that data collected by Africana-studies researchers to implement effectively and seamlessly into the lives of African people, for some varied purposes. So we need to understand that how theory plays in the articulation, of Africana studies and Africology in general. And so I'll just continue. One component of reviewing the literature, which is a stage in the research design process, is to determine what theories might be used to explore the questions in a scholarly study. In a quantitative research, researchers often test theories as an explanation for answers that's supposed to be to their questions. In qualitative research, the use of theory is much more varied. The inquirer may generate a theory as the final outcome of a study and place it at the end of a project, such as in grounded theory. And so if you read Cresswell's text, you'll understand more what grounded theory is. So a definition of a theory. A theory is a set of interrelated constructs, variables, definitions, and propositions or hypotheses that represents a systematic view of a phenomenon by specifying relations among variables with the purpose of explaining natural phenomena. A theory might appear in a research study as an argument, a discussion, or a rationale, and it helps to explain or predict phenomena that occur in the world. And so ideally, usually more so in quantitative analyses, we have to understand the scientific method. And so we'll deal with the scientific method in week 2. But for now, in the stages of the scientific method, you usually have an observation, and then you have a hypothesis to try to explain what it is that you are observing. And so you have a series of hypotheses, and then you test these hypotheses with the intent on eliminating the hypotheses which are not true. And you continue to test and ask new questions and introduce new variables. And after a series of experimentations, then you develop a theory based on the data of the results of the result data that one has accumulated as a result of their experiments. And so, especially in quantitative, you're using it to explain natural phenomena. So understanding that and how a theory simply tries to to make a seamless narrative and link all of the data that was done by the experimentation um, together in a very cohesive manner. And so this in quantitative studies usually comes at the end of the process. And then, once you have developed the theory, then you go and continue to test that theory, with new research questions, new hypotheses, and to continue to test the validity of a theory. So, but in qualitative analysis, you can come up, quote unquote, with a theory prior to any observations and interviews and things of that nature. And after some, more observations and analyses, you will see if your theory has merit or not. But it is usually not developed as a result of experimentation first, and then the theory development to explain the data as the surviving data as a result of experimentation. So we'll continue now with theory as a framework for explaining phenomena, as I just mentioned. A theory helps us understand behavior in a general sense. In scientific use, a theory is a general organizing principle. When we have enough relevant information about behavior, we can develop an explanatory framework that puts all of that information into a nice and neat package, that is, into a theory. In order to develop a theory, we look at the facts that we believe to be true and try to develop a coherent framework that links the facts to one another. The next step is to test the theory to see if it successfully predicts the results of new research. So we generate hypotheses, which are educated guesses about behaviors, and we test those hypotheses with research. The research shows us whether our hypotheses are correct. If so, the theory receives further support. So these are things you got to understand, because when you're evaluating people's ideas in journals or books or just even in conversations, you want to keep in the back of your mind, well, how did they get to this information? What experimentations were done? What is the name, if they have, of a theory, and does it have predictive value? In other words, can I make future hypotheses based on the theories that we have, and will experiments and observations confirm or disconfirm, our hypotheses? Continue. If enough of our hypotheses support a theory, we regard it as more useful in understanding why people act in a certain way. If those hypotheses do not support the theory, we need to revise or abandon the theory. When we conduct research, we should have an open mind about an issue. We might have a preconceived ideas of what to expect, but if we are wrong, we should be willing to change our beliefs. This is what separates science from, a theological approach to life, so to speak, is that when the evidence doesn't support an idea, we must abandon it or revise if certain elements are actually strong. But that is not the case often with especially religious folks. Scientists do not revise or abandon theories based on a single research study, but after enough evidence accumulates showing that a theory needs revision, then we work to determine what would constitute a better model of behavior in question. That's important to know as well. So anybody talking about this one thing, for example, now debunks the theory of evolution. They're not serious, because the theory of evolution is based upon hundreds of thousands of experiments and observations in various different scientific fields. And so, again, a theory is a coherent narrative about the facts that have been accumulated as a result of successful experiments. So you'll be very hard pressed to nullify a theory, especially with one single argument, so to speak. Variation in qualitative research. Theory and qualitative research is used as a broad explanation for behavior and attitudes, and it may be complete with variables, constructs, and hypotheses. Secondly, researchers increasingly use a theoretical lens or perspective in qualitative research, which provides an overall orienting lens for the study of questions of gender, class, and race, or other issues of marginalized groups. Again, and this aspect is dealing more towards qualitative research, so when we're dealing with human beings. But when you're studying natural phenomena, it is still an observation of behaviors, just more mechanical and the like that, phenomena is observing or is adhering to quote unquote universal laws. So, but it's still ultimately the study of behavior. So the study of natural phenomena or human beings as subject, it's all behavior. Continue. This lens becomes an advocacy perspective that shapes the types of questions asked, informs how data are collected and analyzed, and provides a call for action or change. So again, Afrocentricity exists within this framework. And I'll read it again. This lens becomes an advocacy perspective that shapes the types of questions asked, informs how data are collected and analyzed, and provides a call for action or change. And so in Africana studies and Africology in particular, we don't study and research for research and knowledge sake. Everything has a political and social objective. And so we study and research because we plan to utilize this information and implement them in the lives of African people in hopes to improve their lives and conditions. And so, the accuracy of this research is very important because you have living human beings who are going to be the beneficiaries of this research. So we don't want to put anything out there that is inaccurate, and we diminish the quality of life of African people as a result of those who adhere and take in the research that we do. Qualitative research also indicates how the researcher positions himself or herself in the qualitative study, upfront or biased from personal, cultural, or historical context, and how the final written accounts need to be written without further marginalizing individuals by collaborating with participants, etc. So this is very important. Let's read this first part again. So the qualitative research also indicates how the researcher positions himself or herself in the qualitative study. So not only are we looking for the center or the worldview of the participants from which we're studying, how does the researcher fit in the study itself? What is their position? Where are they located in reference to the phenomena being studied? This is the whole argument of Afrocentricity, which we'll see later on. So when people attack Afrocentricity, they don't understand what they're talking about. They try to make it seem as if it is some wild, crazy, militant, jibber jabber that some black folks just came up with. And actually, it is Afrocentricity that shaped how research is done, period. And so now the language of Afrocentricity is in standard research books. So this book here is used primarily for advanced, master's and PhD studies and courses. And so, how they do research now in the social sciences is shaped primarily by Afrocentricity, even if they won't give credit. But this is what we argue here, that the position of the researcher, him or herself, is important to the study. And so we also have to label our biases, or in quantitative research, we say theoretical assumptions. So we know the position and the angle that the researcher tells is coming from. And so some qualitative theoretical perspectives that we must consider. So there's such things as feminist perspectives, racialized discourses, critical theory, queer theory, and disability inquiry. So if all of these are centered, so if they're researching, for example, disabled persons and how they move and operate and feel, in the world, you have to get the perspective and respect the perspective of those who are disabled. You can't, as a non-disabled person, try to interpret their world, especially without any kind of insight from them. And so you must be centered in and located in time and space as a disabled person to understand their worldview and phenomena, their worldview and their perspective on phenomena in the world. And so that goes again for queer theory, critical theory, other racialized discourses, and feminist theory. So when you're studying African people whose perspective is valid when talking about African phenomena, of course, the African people. In other words, you must be African centered in order to accurately depict and accurately articulate, the ideas and feelings and histories of African people. It's just the right and valid academic way of doing the study. There's no way around it. And so I'm teaching y'all, I'm giving y'all sources and ways on how to defend Afrocentricity and to remind folks of these ideas and perspectives. So, review this again and look into your text, and you'll build this confidence and this competence over time. So, we want to keep this in mind. And I included this here. I'll just read it and then I'll tell you why I included this inquiry here. So, essential theory as critical and postmodern perspectives in qualitative inquiry. As the 20th century draws to a close, traditional is now the 21st century. So, traditional social science has come under increasing scrutiny and attack as those espousing critical and postmodernist perspectives challenge objectivist assumptions and traditional norms for the conduct of research. Central to this attack are four interrelated notions. A, research fundamentally involves issues of power. B, the research report is not transparent, but rather it is authored by a raced, gendered, classed, and politically oriented individual. C, race, class, and gender are crucial for understanding experience. And D, historical traditional research has silenced members of oppressed and marginalized groups. So when you're conducting this research, you got to understand the human component of the researcher. That's why we want to know what is the position and how and where is the researcher located in the study. Because, how you even perceive the people you study is based on one's power relations. And so we got to keep all of this in mind. And one of the reasons for this course, even if you're not necessarily involved directly in doing research, if you understand research in terms of trying to put together publications for consumption and analysis and things of that nature, if you understand the research process, you can be a better student and researcher yourself when you're in text. If you're just going to teach, like your family or in the community, you know how to read between the lines because you have this background. And so, this is very critical in understanding, these things. So, the kinds of research now is noting here. Let's read it. As the 20th century draws to a close, traditional social science has come under increasing scrutiny and attack as those espousing critical and postmodernist perspectives challenge objectivist observations and traditional norms for the conduct of research. So you got to remember that at the beginning, or at least at a period in social science development as a discipline, they went under what we call physics in envy. And so, because science, the hard sciences were taking over and being more authoritative in their conclusions, because it's based on experimentation and rigor, the social science attempted to, in many respects, in many respects, even if it wasn't necessarily conscious, to try to compete with the so-called hard sciences, chemistry, physics, astrophysics, things of that nature, quantum mechanics, all of that which is developing, and even the tool of mathematics. And so, and they try to because in quantitative and research methods and in those science, you have more mechanical behavior. And so, in many ways, you can take yourself, the human being, out of the equation, and the instruments that you use can observe and measure, and you can analyze it and try to be as objective as possible. Well, that's not the case when you're studying human beings. And that's what these critics, especially from the Afrocentric camp and just other communities, especially, because, of course, these disciplines in many respects were developed by Europeans who had a Eurocentric worldview and tried to apply their worldview on other human groups as if their perspective was universal. And in many ways, they try to, and some trying to, be rigorous, try to be, objective and disassociate themselves from the study of the people whom they're studying. And so we show that this is not possible, because even the researcher, even how it is funded, the kinds of questions being asked, is all based in part on the power relations between the observer and those being observed. And so these are the things that you have to keep in mind. But this is, the shaping and those attacks were in part done in large by Afrocentric scholars. And so now we're going to get into the Afrocentric method. So part of your week one readings was to read, a brief article on Afrocentricity from Dr. Molefe Kiti-Asante's website. And so, he has written a text called Afrocentricity, and he didn't come up with the term Afrocentricity, but he is the architect of the theory of Afrocentricity as it is applied and used as a framework in the academic study of African people. And so, peep the language and compare it to what we just read. So the Afrocentric method considers that no phenomenon can be apprehended adequately without locating it first. A phenom must be studied and analyzed in relationship to psychological time and space. It must always be located. This is the only way to investigate the complex interrelationships of science and art, design and execution, creation and maintenance, generation and tradition, and other areas bypassed by theory. The Afrocentric method considers phenomena to be diverse, dynamic, and in motion, and therefore it is necessary for a person to accurately note and record the location of phenomena even in the midst of fluctuations. This means that the investigator must know where he or she is standing in the process. Remember what we were just reading earlier about being located, in the research. So we got to know these things. The Afrocentric method is a form of cultural criticism that examines etymological uses of words and terms in order to know the source of an author's location. So a working knowledge of linguistics is important is an important tool in the Afrocentric method. And so as we see here, we analyze the etymology of words, and there's rules and structures on how to go about that analysis. But we pay attention to words, we pay attention to the language, because we're critically reviewing text. And so we can locate where the author is in the study and in their perspectives to see if it is, in fact, if we're talking about African people, is it coming from an African worldview or is it not? You know, and many other things. This allows us to intersect ideas with actions and actions with ideas on the basis of what is pejorative and ineffective and in what is creative and transformative at the political and economic levels. The Afrocentric method seeks to uncover the mask behind the rhetoric of power, privilege, and position in order to establish how principal myths create place. The method enthrones critical reflection that reveals the perception of monolithic power as nothing but the projection of a cadre of adventures. The Afrocentric method locates the imaginative structure of a system of economics, bureau politics, policy of government, expression of cultural form in the attitude, direction, and language of the phenom, be it text, institution, personality, interaction, or event. And I included this here. Pattern theory is discussed in your Cresswell text. And not necessarily Afrocentricity, but I wanted to give an example of how these ideas can merge and how you can utilize these academic frameworks when you're studying certain type of phenomena, especially in this concept of African myths. So we're going to get into the historical aspect of it, and then of course the living social aspect of it in terms of mythology. But how do you frame that academically? How would you explain how myths are developed, especially African myths? What are myths trying to explain? And how are they constructed indigenously within African circles? So I propose that pattern theory could explain Africana myths. And so let's get into pattern theory. So pattern theory does not emphasize logical, deductive reasoning, due to experimentations and stuff like that, necessarily. Like causal theory, it contains an interconnected set of concepts and relationships, but it does not require causal statements. Instead, pattern theory uses a metaphor or analogies so that relationships make sense. Pattern theories are systems of ideas that inform. The concepts and relations within them form a mutually reinforcing closed system. They specify a sequence of phases or link parts to a whole. I read that last part again. Instead, pattern theory uses metaphor or analogy so that relationships make sense. Pattern theories are systems of ideas that inform. The concepts and relations within them form a mutually reinforcing closed system. They specify a sequence of phases or link parts to a whole. And so when we're studying African phenomena of myths, for example, and folk tales and legends, you should understand them in the context of pattern theory as a series of metaphors put together to try to explain phenomena, but are not necessarily causal explanations for the reality for which the myth metaphorizes and tries to simply explain and link concepts together in a very unique and creative way. And so for a lot of us who are African-centered, we like to study African religion. And part of African religion is the study of African myths. So now you have a framework of introduce you to a framework for further study, by which you can, analyze, African myths. And so when you understand theory, you use it to make predictions and to explain phenomena. And in this case, I would argue that we can use pattern theory to help to explain African mythology and folktale. And so this is how we, kind of merge these things. So also when you're doing, research, you got to be mindful of fallacious arguments. And so we're just going to go through a few. We're going to have a whole module on fallacious arguments, logic and debate. But for now, I'm just going to, pre-introduce you to some concepts. So, you got to know your fallacies. And, people even with good intention, often make fallacious arguments. And as a critical researcher, you have to be able to spot these faulty arguments, because you'll find these a lot in a lot of people's research. And so ad hominem, which, for example, is the Latin for to the man. The attempt is to discredit an opponent by attacking the person instead of the argument. For example, what would you know about labor laws? You don't even have a job. So the person is attacking the other person for not having a job, but just because one doesn't have a job at the current moment has no bearing on whether that other person knows about labor laws. They're not even related, but people, because they don't have a good counter argument to something, will often devolve into ad hominem attacks. And so you got to be able to spot those. Faulty cause, therefore substituting association for causation. For example, many women claim to be pacifists, but before women got the vote, there were no nuclear weapons. These are parallel issues here and not related, and one doesn't cause the other. And so you got to be careful of these faulty causes in text. And so you'll read a lot of that. False dilemma, presenting only two possible alternatives to a complex situation when in fact there were many more. For example, you don't support our troops, and that makes you a traitor. Well, the person could not support our troops for other reasons, but whoever is making this quote unquote argument is only providing one explanation, which doesn't necessarily mean it's not true regardless. So that makes you a traitor. So you have to define what a traitor is, and whether a support of something constitutes that you're a traitor. So guilt by association, the attempt to discredit an opponent by associating their argument with an undesirable idea or person. For example, how can you defend Christianity? Torquemada was a Christian. I don't know who Torquemada is, but I assume this person was bad. So we can also say, for example, Hitler. We can replace it with Hitler. Hitler was a Christian. And so because Hitler was a Christian, that supposedly makes all Christians bad. So you're guilty by association. And so you'll read some old research data and just even some current arguments. So if I'm from South Central LA or Fifth Ward, Houston, or from Brooklyn, New York, I'm from North Philly, because there are bad elements there and in certain of high crime, then that makes me automatically guilty by association. So now I should be labeled as a thug, a pimp, and all this other kind of stuff, because some people within our communities actually, behave that way, but are a small minority. But because, people want to make these arguments, they'll try to use something like that against you. And so you got to be mindful of these things. So loaded question, a question which limits the range of discourse by containing a controversial or unjustified assumption. For example, in your opinion, what makes the iPhone the best smartphone? So, the assumption is that the person who's being asked the question automatically thinks that the iPhone is the best smartphone. That's an assumption. And so we assume, at least in this case, that assumption is not valid. There was no argumentation or any kind of hint that this person believes the iPhone is, in fact, the best smartphone. So the question is loaded from the beginning. And these are my bibliographic resources, that you may want to consider. So you can pause these and write these down if you would like. And so actually our Cresswell is 2009, my bad. I said 2007 earlier. But research design, qualitative, quantitative, or mixed method approaches. That's, what I have been citing from. And then you should have this book here, Jardy Phillips, Writing African History. That's one of the books that you can download. There's another text, Balancing Written History with Oral Tradition. Here's a book that I was reading from, Fallacies and Argument Appraisal, Critical Reasoning and Argumentation. And, Bernard and McCarthy, Research Methods and Statistics. I'm trying to see if that's part of one of your books as well. We won't necessarily read from it, but it's in your text. So Molefe Kiti Asante, The Afrocentric Idea, Molefe Asante, Afrocentricity. This is his Afrocentricity link that you should have already. And, another article which you may want to utilize is Using the Afrocentric Method in Indigenous African Culture. So you get, if you find this article by Quinique Makabela, then you'll see how that is done in actual research and the methods and things of that. And again, of course, it's a qualitative refining and qualitative study. So this is a journal article in the qualitative report. So this concludes week 1's introduction, and I will see you in week 2. Thank you.